Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, bringing you a special show on Russia's presidential elections. He's back. Well, let's be honest, he never really went away. Vladimir Putin is understood to have won a first-round victory with almost two-thirds of the vote. This means the strongman of Russian politics will return to the Kremlin for 6 more years, maybe even double that. While a Putin win does not come as much of a surprise, it does not mean that the result is the end of the matter. Opponents say the vote was fixed. Protesters are expected to take to the streets, decrying Putin as an authoritarian who rules over a corrupt system. So, was the election free and fair? Was the alleged ballot fixing bad enough to enrage the opposition into serious action? And what does the future hold for Putin, Russia, and its 143 million people? To probe these big questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Mikhail Margelov, chairman of the Russian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, James Nixey from the think tank Chatham House, Dr. Maxine David from the University of Surrey, Aleksandr Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor, and Alex Pravda from St. Antony's College, Oxford. We'll turn straight away to you, Mikhail, because you're over there in Moscow. Can you give us a roundup of the feeling to the Putin success?
I think that it was easy to predict that Putin wins the elections. There was some kind of discussion on if Putin wins in the first round or in the second round. So one question is already answered. The victory was gained in the first round. The most surprising, to my mind, result of this rally was the third position, which was got by Mikhail Prokhorov, the young, rich, and successful Russian businessman who suddenly became a politician and presidential candidate. The fact that Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who is a kind of dinosaur from the Russian political Jurassic Park, is only on the fourth position, and Sergei Mironov is almost out of the picture, and the guy was just recently Speaker of the Federation Council, the upper house of the Russian parliament, is very characteristic. So I would like to repeat it again. Putin is back, some analysts say, but to my mind, he has never been out of the picture. He has always been in. Taking the position of the prime minister 4 years ago and being the Russian prime minister, he was in charge of many issues which mostly were dedicated to the Russian economic development and Russian internal politics. And I would like to quote Dmitry Medvedev, who said last night, being together with Vladimir Putin at a great meeting at Manezhnaya Square in the center of Moscow near the Kremlin walls, Medvedev said, "We have won." That means that Putin and Medvedev are still one team. They will be working together. And, well, this team does not have any major disagreement inside it.
Okay, we'll return to the studio over here. Perhaps, James, you can give us your feelings on the result.
I think perhaps in contrast to the parliamentary elections in December, then we have perhaps a return to more predictable politics in Russia for the time being. Perhaps to comment on a couple of Mr. Margelov's fascinating comments, and clearly I agree with the statistics that he has offered us, that is entirely true. The extent of the fraud, the election rigging, has yet to be determined. The OSCE will produce a report on this in due course. The opposition groups, of course, there's a certain amount of wish fulfillment. They wish there to be fraud. I'm sure there was a certain amount of it. It's impossible for there not to have been, but we need some careful analysis and some statistics checking in order to fully ascertain the extent of it. I am amused, I have to say, by the comments on Mikhail Prokhorov, who has done so very well on debut, as if it's a kind of a cricket match or a football match, and it doesn't seem to be quite an appropriate comment. And Putin's congratulations of Mr. Prokhorov also struck a note of humour. And the point about "we have won," Medvedev's comments in Manezhnaya Square last night is also somewhat interesting. It is not quite clear if he meant. I mean, again, there could be a certain amount of wish fulfillment there. He clearly would like to stay in a prominent position, a spotlighted position. Mr. Putin's own position in the last 4 years as Prime Minister was the best position he could possibly have had. I remember touting 4 years ago, could he have been chairman of Gazprom or head of a security committee or head of a judiciary? But no, he chose a position where he would be most in the public spotlight other than the presidency, the best he could have done. And clearly this is a sort of something for Medvedev to aspire to as well, to, if he hasn't got the top spot, then to have the next best thing. But anyway, as I say, all in all, a return to predictable politics, at least for the time being.
You talk about Medvedev saying we have won. These are also the words that came out of Putin's mouth on Sunday night. He said, we have won in an open and honest battle. Perhaps I can put that one over to you, Dr. Maxine. Open and honest battle?
Absolutely not. I spent most of yesterday on Twitter and just looking at all the tweets from people. It's very, very clear that at least people in Moscow do not feel that this was honest or open. I think that concentrating too much on what actually happened on the day is a bit of a mistake. We need to think much more about the media coverage. We need to think about access of independence, etc. So why could Kasyanov not stand, for instance? These are the bigger problems that the Russians are going to have to grapple with over the coming days and weeks, months probably.
Aleksandr?
Well, I think that we are looking backwards rather than forwards. I think we should look at what's going to happen now after the elections. First of all, I didn't see any proof of any vote rigging, specific proof. The opposition in every country, even in Britain and in America, talks about rigging and irregularities. So let's see the details. Let's see the proof. At the moment, there's nothing. I think the more interesting thing is, will Putin stay for the whole term? Will Medvedev be prime minister for long? People I've spoken to in Moscow feel that Medvedev is too weak. Medvedev will not last more than 2 years. That a stronger candidate may emerge, like, for example, Alexei Kudrin, who is a technocrat, who is a brilliant finance minister, who would be a great prime minister, by the way, and probably a president. And he has good relations with Putin. So that might be an interesting development. Will Putin change his ways and his policies after winning the election? He might, because he's no longer obliged by all those agreements that he had with Yeltsin and Yeltsin's people. He might even have a pop at some of the oligarchs who are actually causing a lot of grief to the Russian economy. I think it's a very interesting time. I think we should be actually looking at Russia becoming a more democratic, a more developed country, rather than talking about who says what about vote rigging, because it's just looking backwards rather than forwards.
You say it's looking backwards, but aren't we expecting that the size of the opposition movement and the number of people that come out onto the streets of Moscow on Monday or later this week is going to be dependent on how they feel that the vote has taken place?
Well, the point is that the Western hacks, they look at Moscow and St. Petersburg and judge the national mood by these two cities. Unfortunately, Moscow and St. Petersburg are different from most regions and provinces. And I can tell you that in the regions and provinces, Putin probably had quite a serious support, quite big support in percentage points. So don't judge Russia by Moscow and St. Petersburg. Also, don't forget that Russian opposition is fragmented. It doesn't really have any charismatic figures. You just asked about Kasyanov. Why didn't he stand? Who's going to vote for him? Kasyanov is yesterday's man. He comes from Yeltsin's worst time when he was called Mikhail 2% or something. So, we don't really see any young, ambitious, sort of charismatic leaders. So I don't really think that Putin had a tough time, against those. Mikhail mentioned dinosaurs. He called Zhirinovsky a dinosaur. Zhirinovsky should not be in the elections. I think this election was the last for him. There should not be any communists like Zyuganov, which is an embarrassment, to be honest. So I think that Putin was the only choice, basically. I don't really tell me if anybody sees anybody else. And Prokhorov, I don't agree really with Mikhail. I think Prokhorov was a joke. What he was saying, 6 days working per week and joining the euro, it sometimes seemed he didn't want to be elected saying those things. So no, Prokhorov proves once again the oligarchs are not very bright. They didn't really create much wealth for Russia. I think it's time for them to go, to be honest.
Alex, I want to let you have a chance to come in there from Oxford. Obviously, we've got very, very diverse opinions on here. What do you think is important?
Let's start off with the degree of fraud. I think that's significant and symbolic terms, but not in terms of actual numbers. We'll have a tussle about this. What's significant is that there is a tension on the process of election, and that legitimacy of the rulers is gauged partly in terms of fair and democratic process. That's a huge change, and I don't think it's one which is going to be reversed. So I think the political climate of Russia has been changed by the December elections, by the demonstrations, and by whatever follows these elections. So the number of violations, whether it's 5,000 or 3,000, is less important than the response to them. They are going to be a cause on which to hang a whole lot of criticism of the ruling authorities. So that's the one thing. Second thing is that it's interesting that Putin took a very combative tone in congratulating his supporters on the victory. It was full of adversarial language, full of nationalist language, glory to Russia, we have won, against the enemies of Russia, both external and internal. That denotes to me a rather defensive position, not one of great confidence. That didn't exude from him. He was very emotional, very relieved, I think, to get 63, 64, at least formally speaking, a first-round victory. So that again changes the nature of the relationship. Putin's legitimacy was based previously on being a confident father of the nation, the national leader unquestionably. Now there are questions to be raised. There are elements of politics being reintroduced. That brings me to the next point. Who else? There is no alternative Mrs. Thatcher used to use applies to Russia. There isn't a major alternative leader. But the point is that conditions create leaders. If there is a continuing process of criticism, street politics, nationalist language, we will get a Navalny plus kind of leader emerging from the streets and from the internet. And then the authorities will have to respond to that. Already Putin is trying to take two sets of grounds. One is the nationalist ground, which we saw in his rhetoric. Secondly is the populist ground, talking about countering inequality, luxury taxes, punishing the rich or the excessively rich. But can he deliver? And this brings to the third point, which your last comment actually raised very rightly, the economic situation. Putin, in the run-up to the campaign, has pledged enormous numbers of things, including 25 million new jobs. He has introduced large increases in public workers' salaries. But it needs something like $150 to $200 a barrel of oil to sustain that sort of program, plus the huge military increases. And the point is, can he deliver? He needs professionals. I agree with those who've said Medvedev will not last very long. He needs people like Kudrin and other professionals to provide the kind of economic growth that it can match the delivery promises. So I think that Putin has on his plate a large number of new problems to do with politics. And I think we have to remember, Putin is not really a politician. He finds politics difficult. He's someone who's a leader and administrator of the nation. He doesn't regard politics as what is right for Russia. In other words, politics is about clashes of opinion. It's about legitimate competition. It's about a loyal opposition. And there doesn't seem to be any notion of a loyal, constructive opposition emerged within the ruling elite.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and we're hosting a debate on Russia's presidential elections. I'm James Reinl. I'm joined by Mikhail Margelov, chairman of the Russian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, James Nixey from the think tank Chatham House, Dr. Maxine David from the University of Surrey, Aleksandr Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor, and Alex Pravda from St. Antony's College, Oxford. Mikhail, I want to go back to you in Moscow because I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to get the Russian position on. Points raised by some of the panelists here is that not only were there allegations of the ballot actually being fixed on Sunday, but a sort of pre-fixing of the system itself. Dr. Maxine raised issues of lack of fair media coverage in Russia and even some candidates being prevented from standing. How do you respond to those allegations?
Well, of course, after any elections in any country, we always see a lot of criticism. The opposition is always unhappy. And, of course, there will be a lot of critical comments on the way the elections were organized, the way the results were calculated, and so on and so forth. I think that we shall be learning more.
Well, they wouldn't be criticized if they were considered fair, would they?
Well, I think that the elections were fair enough, and I took part in these elections myself. I know from my constituency what were the results and what were the impressions. What is important to my mind to say about the presidential elections is to speak about the substance. People are becoming citizens. People are not just consumers anymore. Russia was a happy society of consumers during the last 15 years when people were resting peacefully on the cozy cushions of high hydrocarbon prices. But after the Duma elections, people are awakening, people are becoming citizens, and they are asking tough questions that the political class has to respond. So I think that in the forthcoming years we shall see a new political generation emerging. We shall see more new leaders emerging. And I think that Putin understands that pretty well, and she's ready to address all those challenges that he will face during his new term. Another important comment, to my mind, Medvedev has been criticized for his weakness since he wasn't president 4 years ago. And there were a lot of comments saying that Medvedev will not last long as a president. He stayed as a president for the whole term. And I think that he will work as a prime minister in the future.
Turning to Dr. Maxine, I want to throw a couple of things at you. It's a point that Aleksandr raised, which is the popularity of Putin, particularly when you go outside of these big urban metropolitan areas. You know, think beyond Moscow. I want to read a couple of quotes to you from what some of the people have been reported as saying. Here's Maria Budeva, just an ordinary 38-year-old university teacher. She says, "I want stability. I don't want any kind of change." Reza Sidorik, 64-year-old housewife, she says that Putin knows the economy, he knows the political system. It seems to me he's the best candidate. The thing that doesn't fit in with your paradigm is that Putin remains popular.
I don't think there's any denying that he's popular, but why is he popular? If he doesn't give any time on the media to anybody else, then of course he's going to look like the popular candidate. Just to pick up on a couple of those comments, though, I want stability. If you ask that person, do they want stability or do they want stagnation, what would they say? There's a very, very fine line, I think, here between what Russia is facing in stability terms and stagnation. It's no surprise that people are comparing Putin to Brezhnev right now. OK, he doesn't want to be a Gorbachev, but does he really want to be a Brezhnev? And I think also that you have to think about the media through which Putin has become less popular. And the internet has been very, very important here. We know that the further you go out into Russia and the provinces, the more unequal access is to the internet. Also, arguably, these people have less luxury than those who live in the big cities in terms of just kind of getting by in everyday life. And actually, Putin himself alluded to that when he went back to his campaign headquarters and was going through the video communications with party supporters out in the provinces and talking about the working classes and how they just get on with things, unlike the middle classes who stand around in Moscow protesting on the back of reforms that he has put in place over a number of years. Actually, he understands what the problem is here. People in the provinces maybe don't have the luxury, they don't have this type of access. But even so, I don't think anybody is denying that Putin is popular. For those who are old enough to remember, they do not want to see another 1991 and the Yeltsin years that followed. They do want that stability. That doesn't mean that there aren't alternatives, better alternatives. Russia needs to change. It's been doing gradual change for a very, very long time now compared to other Eastern European countries. And look where it is in relation to them.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a debate on Russia's presidential elections. I'm joined by Mikhail Margelov, chairman of the Russian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, James Nixey from the think tank Chatham House, Dr. Maxine David from the University of Surrey, Aleksandr Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor, and Alex Pravda from St. Antony's College, Oxford. I'm going to turn to you now, James, because we don't have a great deal of time left. I would like to look forward a little bit now. What are we likely to see maybe in this week from the opposition movement? And what does a return to power for Putin really mean over the long term? Dr. Maxine raises the issue of stagnation, which I think ties in with some of the elements of the report you've been working on for Chatham House. Perhaps you could tell us about that.
Yes, the Chatham House report suggests that Putin is, by his own hand, sadly, damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. By which I mean, if he reforms, then reform implies an end to the system which he himself has created, the elite around him, a very powerful elite, because that's the only way in which Russia can genuinely undergo a wide-ranging modernisation and social and economic reform. If he doesn't do that, if he doesn't reform and he holds his old firm line, then Russia will indeed, as Maxine suggested, continue to stagnate on the basis of a number of economic, social and particularly demographic factors. And therefore Russia will equally drop into a decline. So Russia is facing a very difficult choice of a devil and deep blue sea, if you like, right now, and it's hard to escape that without letting the cat out of the bag. But this current elite is basically all about self-sustainment. One of the reasons why this election has actually run a great deal more successfully than the December one is they've had quite a lot of time to think about how to do it a lot better. They were complacent in December. They spent a lot of time ensuring that no colour revolution happens here. Could I just address very quickly the question of legitimacy? And the problem is by starting out with violations and with a less legitimate mandate than he had in, say, 2000, then he's already bruised and battered at the beginning. Now, any leader, no matter who it is, from David Cameron to Robert Mugabe, is always going to do worse at the end than at the beginning. They start off, people getting the benefit of a doubt, they start off with a mandate. Now, with the protests and the voter fraud, then he starts off at a disadvantage, and so events will happen. Whether it's if you extrapolate from the last 12 years, the Kursk, the Nordost, the Beslan, the global economic crisis, then these things are going to happen again, just in slightly different formats, and these will continue to bruise and batter him, and there's only so much he can take, and that's why this idea of the beginning of the end of Putin is suddenly so high on the agenda.
Alex, this is what you wanted to do. You wanted to look forward, not backwards. Do you agree with that? Are we going to see an increasingly bruised and battered Putin? Is that what you see on the horizon?
Well, I think that any politician who stays over 10 years has problems. I mean, look at Margaret Thatcher. There is a certain limit to any political career, but I think Putin comes to power at a time when Russia is actually not looking that bad compared, for example, to what is going on in Europe. Let's face it, Europe is in meltdown. What's going to happen to the euro? What's going to happen to the economies of the southern states? America is not in a very fine shape as well. So I think it's the first time ever that Putin has an opportunity, for example, to start attracting investment, foreign investment, a lot of it. But for that, he needs to tackle some of the issues inside, and that would be the oligarchs. I'm coming back to them. These are the people who block these investments. I can give you an example of BP. Now, BP has invested billions and billions into Russia. It has provided $150 billion of tax and duties to the Russian budget. But what we are witnessing now is that some minority shareholders are suing this corporation for $100 billion because allegedly they are suffering because of that collapse deal with Rosneft and so on. Putin has to stop this. He has to get those people together, the oligarchs, and say, look, we need foreign investment. We need new technologies from the West. So stop this. And I hope he's going to do this. And I think that financially, Russia is not looking bad at all compared to other countries. I actually think that China probably is going to face many more difficulties. So I think what is going to happen now is that Putin really, really needs to look at his team. He really needs to change his ministers. He can't continue with the same team. They're just old, not in age terms, but they just don't offer anything. And if he does that, and if he starts changing the structure and getting more foreign investment into the country, I think he has another 5-6 years of quite jolly time. After that, of course, it's difficult to say. I still think he might be tempted to step down after the first term or even during the first term at the end.
Okay, Alex, I'm going to turn to you for some final comments because we're running out of time here. But that was Aleksandr talking about what he sees coming up. And he thinks that Putin can hang on for maybe this one term, but he needs to have a bit of a revamp. How do you see it?
I agree that he's likely to be one term rather than two, because I think Putin has on his hands two very difficult sets of problems. One you've discussed is modernization, economic development and avoidance of stagnation. Maybe that would succeed with professionals in power. The second is a little bit more tricky for someone of his generation. A new kind of politics. On the one hand, Mikhail talked about the emergence of a new political generation, but Putin is not one of that generation, and he'll find it much more difficult to manage them even on his own side. And they have to deal with a newly emerging civil society, citizens, as was said, not consumers. So the whole nature of politics is changing in Russia, and I think Putin may see himself as somebody who has done well in the old politics and can only stay for 6 years of the new.
Okay, that was Alex Pravda from St Antony's College, Oxford, rounding up our debate on the presidential election, saying Putin is in, but there's big challenges ahead, not just for him, but for Russia also. I was joined by James Nixey from the think tank Chatham House, Mikhail Margelov, chairman of the Russian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, Dr. Maxine David from the University of Surrey, and Aleksandr Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.